The wind moaned across the plains like an old spirit wandering the earth, its voice carrying the scent of snow, pine, and blood yet to be spilled. In the distance, mountains rose like silent, watchful sentinels, their peaks wrapped in a shroud of gray clouds. Between those peaks stretched a frozen valley, its floor blanketed in snow that looked untouched. But the truth was, it had been walked by ghosts of battles past. On this day, it would be walked again. The sun hung low, its light weak and filtered, offering no warmth to the thousands gathered here. Across the valley, banners whipped violently, one field painted crimson, the other a stark white. These were not colors chosen for beauty, but for loyalty and bloodline, Terra and Minamoto. The air between them was heavy, as if the land itself understood what was about to happen. Somewhere among the ranks, a figure sat upon a black warhorse, her posture as steady as the mountain behind her. Beneath her helmet, her eyes were steady, not the wide, frantic eyes of a warrior about to die, but the cold, measured gaze of one who had lived for this moment. She was Tomo Guzan, and in the war-torn Japan of the 12th century, her name was already a whisper that carried more weight than steel. The first sound to cut through the howl of the wind was the deep, rolling beat of a war drum. One strike, then another, each one reverberating in the chest of every man and woman who stood on the field. Drums were the heartbeat of battle in this era. Not just a signal, but a reminder of unity, of shared purpose. The Minamoto drummers stood behind their lines, each man holding a massive mallet, striking the taut hide stretched across carved wooden frames. In the enemy line, the Terra answered with their own drum beats, sharper and quicker, as though they meant to quicken the blood in their warriors before the first arrow even flew. Above the drums came the creak of bowstrings as archers drew back, testing the strength of their weapons against the freezing air. The horses shifted restlessly, their breath steaming in great clouds. Some pawed at the snow, eager to run. And above it all, the sky brooded, pale and heavy, as though it too held its breath. Somewhere deep in the Minamoto formation, a woman adjusted the fit of her armor, running a gloved hand along the ridge of her helmet, not because it was loose, but because it was ritual. She had done this before every battle she had fought, and each time, she had lived to see the day's end. She intended to do so again. The snow did not fall in gentle flakes here. It came in sudden, cutting gusts, each flurry a wall of white that blurred the lines between earth and sky. Through those gusts, the shapes of men and horses appeared and vanished, like visions half-remembered from a dream. The ground beneath them was treacherous, frozen hard yet slick with a thin layer of ice hidden under the powder. Every step taken by man or beast had to be deliberate. One slip could send a rider sprawling beneath the crush of hooves. And yet, there was no hesitation in the formations. The Minamoto line stood in disciplined rows, each warrior's armor layered in lacquered plates that creaked softly as they shifted. The colors were muted in the snowlight, black, deep green, shades of brown, but every suit bore the white insignia of their clan. Opposite them, the Terra were brighter, their crimson banners and accents like splashes of blood against the pale world. They were no less disciplined, no less dangerous. Between them stretched the killing ground, silent for now, but waiting. Always waiting. At the head of one wing, Tomo Guzan sat unmoving, her gloved hand resting lightly on the hilt of her blade, her other hand on the reins. She was part of the silence, part of the stillness, and yet she was the storm waiting to break. The war she rode into today had begun long before she took her place in it. The Genpei War was not born in a single insult or a lone act of treachery. It was a culmination of decades of simmering tensions, of shifting alliances, of grudges carried like hidden knives. The Minamoto and Terra clans were not merely military rivals. They were political powers intertwined with the imperial court itself. Each victory on the battlefield could tilt the balance of the emperor's favor, and each defeat could undo years of careful positioning. Kyoto, the shining capital, was far from this frozen plain, but its shadow reached here nonetheless. Court nobles would speak of the coming clash in soft voices over warm sake, their silken sleeves brushing against polished wood, their eyes darting to be sure no servant listened too closely. They would wager on the outcome, as though it were a game of Go. But for those here, standing in the snow, this was no game. This was survival, and the cost of losing was not embarrassment or loss of influence. It was death, swift and cold. Tomo understood this better than most. She had seen it before. The way a man could go from shouting a war cry to lying silent in the snow in the span of a breath. It was why she fought as though each breath might be her last, because one day it would be. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint metallic scent that every seasoned warrior recognized instantly: blood. It was not yet thick in the air, which meant the battle had not started, but somewhere, someone had already paid the war's first toll. Perhaps a scout caught in an ambush, perhaps a rider who had fallen in the icy ravine that lay beyond the Minamoto flank. Tomo's eyes narrowed as she scanned the ridges, her gaze sweeping across the uneven ground as though she could see through the snow itself. A soldier to her right glanced in her direction, his breath fogging inside his mask, as if to ask whether she had seen something. She gave no sign, neither nod nor shake of the head. The truth was, she trusted her instincts more than any scout's report, and her instincts told her the storm they were waiting for was closer than it appeared. She loosened her sword in its scabbard with the smallest movement, a gesture that was both habit and preparation. Somewhere beyond the banners, her enemies were doing the same. In the stillness before the clash, even the smallest sound, the slide of steel against wood, the creak of leather straps, was deafening. It was in moments like this, when the two sides stood staring across the void between them, that the mind began to wander. For younger warriors, thoughts might drift to home, to mothers, wives, children waiting with worry they would never voice aloud. For older ones, it might drift to past battles, to friends who had once stood in the line beside them, but now lay buried beneath other battlefields. Tomo's thoughts never wandered far from the present. It was not because she was free of fear, no warrior truly was, but because she had trained herself to leave no space for it. Fear was a seed, and if it took root before the first arrow flew, it could choke every decision she might need to make. So she stayed rooted in the now, in the way her horse shifted its weight beneath her, in the sharp smell of pine and snow, in the feel of the leather grip beneath her fingers. The world could shrink to these things, to this clarity, until even the roar of war could not shake her. It was this discipline, as much as her skill with sword and bow, that had made her name a legend whispered in the tents of enemies. A name not carried by the wind, but carved into it. The first rider moved, not a charge, not yet, but a slow step forward that broke the stillness like a pebble dropped into a frozen lake. All eyes shifted toward him, though no one shouted or raised a weapon. In the language of war, such gestures spoke volumes, a test, a statement, a message that we are ready and we are not afraid. The man's horse exhaled steam into the cold, each breath hanging briefly before fading into nothingness. Tomo watched him with the same detachment one might give to the first flake in a blizzard, knowing full well it was only the beginning. Her grip on the reins remained loose, her sword still sheathed, but every muscle in her body was coiled in quiet readiness. She had seen battles begin in many ways, with a sudden volley of arrows, with an unplanned surge by overzealous troops, or with a deliberate, calculated signal from a commander. She wondered, as the rider paused and glanced back toward his own line, which kind this would be. Somewhere behind her, the low mutter of men adjusting their gear rippled through the Minamoto formation. The tension was building, and like the slow boil of water, it was only a matter of time before it overflowed. From where she sat, the battlefield stretched out like an untouched scroll waiting for its ink. Every patch of snow, every shadowed ridge, every narrow gap between trees could become a story written in blood by the day's end. The drums had stopped for the moment, as if the earth itself were holding its breath before the plunge. Far away, the faint clink of armor and the shift of horse hooves reached her ears, dulled by the snow but distinct enough to map their position in her mind. The Terra were aligning their cavalry, a subtle change in formation that told her more than any scout's report could. She had learned to read such movements like words on a page. The lean of a rider, the angle of a spear, the way a banner's tip pointed in the wind. Theirs was a language only seasoned warriors could hear, and Tomo had become fluent in it long ago. Her mind began arranging the battlefield into layers, where the first clash would erupt, where the lines would bend, where the inevitable break might come. Her breathing slowed until each inhale felt like a counted beat in a rhythm only she could hear. The quiet before the battle was not emptiness, it was a canvas, and she was preparing her brush. The wind surged again, this time carrying with it the deep, resonant call of the third horn, the one that erased hesitation. The Minamoto ranks erupted in motion, the crunch of snow under hooves building into a deafening thunder that rolled across the plain. Tomo leaned forward, her body and horse moving as one, the weight of her armor forgotten in the surge. Around her, the world fractured into motion. Banners streaming, arrows loosed into the gray sky, the first clash of steel ringing like temple bells struck in rage. But through the chaos, Her focus was unshakable, the enemy commander's crimson crest burning in her sight like a mark she had been born to strike. She knew this moment would be remembered, not because she was a woman among warriors, but because she would ride through the heart of the enemy and carve her name deeper into the soul of the war. Snow and blood would mix before the day was done, and the plains of Owazu would never again lie silent. For Tomo Guzan had entered the battle, and when she entered, history itself leaned closer to watch. The snow-covered plains of Owazu were not just the stage for one woman's legend. They were the final chapter in a story that had been written for decades before her birth. To understand Tomo Guzan's place in history, one must first step back into the world of 12th century Japan, a land fractured by ambition and blood. This was the twilight of the Heian period, when the glittering elegance of the imperial court in Kyoto masked the growing unrest beyond its walls. The Minamoto and Taira clans were not simply families. They were dynasties, each tracing their bloodlines to emperors of the past, each convinced that their claim to power was the truest. They had been allies once, fighting together to suppress rebellions and defend the court, but power breeds rivalry as surely as drought breeds fire. Whispers of betrayal turned into open accusations, and accusations into bloodshed. By the year 1180, the tension snapped, and the Genpei War began, a conflict that would not end until one clan lay shattered and the other stood alone. The Genpei War was unlike the local skirmishes that Japan had known before. It was total clan against clan, with shifting alliances and betrayals that redrew the map again and again. Minamoto banners of stark white faced the deep crimson of the Taira across fields, rivers, and city gates. Each battle was a dance of cavalry charges, arrow volleys, and sudden duels between champions seeking to earn glory not only for themselves, but for their entire house. Victory brought political rewards, new titles, new lands, while defeat could mean the loss of one's family, name, and head in a single day. The court in Kyoto played a dangerous game of balance, offering favor to whichever clan seemed strongest in the moment, hoping to keep the war from consuming the capital itself. But outside the city, in the provinces, the samurai were no longer content to be servants to the court. They had begun to see themselves not merely as soldiers, but as a class apart, warriors whose loyalty was to their clan first, and whose honor could be measured only by their deeds in battle. Would you like me to continue this setting the stage section in the same cinematic, paragraph-by-paragraph style, until the role of women and early Bushido are fully built in? That will make it flow like your hook, but with more depth for the episode's pacing. The rise of the samurai class was not sudden, nor was it peaceful. For generations, warriors had served the noble families of the court as enforcers, guards, and provincial militia, their power tied to the whims of the aristocracy. But war has a way of reshaping the order of things. The Genpei War gave these warriors something greater than employment. It gave them purpose, identity, and the chance to carve their names into history with the edge of a blade. No longer were they simply retainers bound to the orders of distant nobles. They became leaders in their own right, their loyalty bound by blood and battle instead of ceremony. Battles decided more than victory or defeat. They decided who would live to shape the politics of the next decade. The countryside became a chessboard, each province a square fought over by mounted warriors who could strike quickly and vanish into the mountains or forests before retaliation could arrive. In this crucible of constant warfare, a new ideal began to take form, a way of life built on discipline, loyalty, skill, and an unshakable acceptance of death. The samurai of the 12th century were not yet bound by the fully formed Bushido code, but the seeds of that philosophy were already being planted in the snow and soil. It was, however, a world where the role of women was sharply defined and almost never on the battlefield. In the eyes of most men, women were meant to guard the home, raise children, and manage estates while the warriors fought. They could be skilled in weapons, especially the naginata, a curved-blade polearm favored for home defense, but such training was considered practical, not honorable. True honor, in the eyes of the age, came from standing in the open field, facing the enemy in a mounted charge, and staking one's life in public combat. This was the realm of men, and women who entered it risked not only their lives but their reputations. And yet, there were exceptions, rare, remarkable women known as onabugeisha, trained in the arts of war and capable of holding their own against any male warrior. They were the product of extraordinary circumstances. Being born into a military family, growing up in frontier provinces, or surviving in times when the line between peace and war could shift overnight. Tomo Guzan was one such exception, and her story would test the boundaries of what a woman could be in a samurai's world. 4. Do you want me to continue into the Bushido's early form part of this section, so we can close out the setting the stage point before moving to her early life? Bushido, as it would later be known, did not yet exist as a written code in the days of Tomo Guzan. It was an unwritten agreement, a shared understanding between warriors forged by generations of battle. Honor was measured not by wealth or titles, but by courage in the face of death and loyalty to one's lord above all else. A samurai who abandoned his master in the heat of combat could never again walk among his peers without shame, shame that was often worse than execution. Death was not feared, it was accepted as the inevitable cost of living by the sword. To face death without flinching was to embody the ideal of the warrior, and to meet it in service of one's clan was the highest achievement a life could earn. Even so, this emerging philosophy had its contradictions. Loyalty to one's lord could conflict with loyalty to family. Honor on the battlefield could demand acts of cruelty far from noble. It was a path of sacrifice, and once a samurai walked it, there was no turning back. In this world, Tomo Guzan would rise, not as an anomaly, but as proof that the soul of a warrior could belong to anyone willing to claim it. 5. If you want, I can now start. Tomo's early life and training in the same deep, cinematic pacing, so it flows naturally from. Tomo Guzan's story began far from the polished halls of Kyoto, in the rugged, snowbound mountains of Echigo province. This was a land where winter ruled for months at a time, burying the valleys under deep drifts and turning rivers into slabs of ice. Life here did not allow for weakness. Every man, woman, and child was expected to work, endure, and adapt. It was not a place for delicate courtiers or ornamental nobility. The mountains shaped their people into something harder, like the pine trees that bent beneath the snow but did not break. It was in this harsh cradle that Tomo was born, into a family whose livelihood depended on skill with the bow, the sword, and the horse. Her childhood was not marked by silk kimonos or courtly lessons. It was filled with the sting of cold air in her lungs, the weight of training weapons in her hands, and the smell of leather and horse sweat. Where other girls learned to embroider and pour tea, Tomo learned to string a bow in freezing wind and draw it steady even as her fingers numbed. Her playground was not a garden, but the uneven ridges where footing could mean the difference between life and a fatal fall. And from the beginning, she carried herself not as a child playing at games, but as a warrior in training, even if the world had yet to call her one. 6. If you want, I can keep early life and training running in this same cinematic style, showing her gradual transformation into a battlefield commander. Shall I continue? Years, Tomo's days followed a rhythm of discipline that would break most grown men. She rose before the sun, often while frost still glazed the inside of the shutters, and began with stretches and balance drills to keep her movements swift and precise. Her father or elder brothers would have her run the narrow ridgelines above the village, forcing her to learn how to control her footing on terrain where a single misstep meant a tumble into the rocks below. When she could run those paths without hesitation, they gave her a bow nearly as tall as she was. At first, she could barely bend it, her small arms trembling with the effort, but she learned slowly, painfully, to draw and release without flinching. By the time she could string and fire it 10 times in a row, she could already strike targets at distances that made the village boys gape. There was no praise for this. In her household, skill was expected, not rewarded. The reward was survival, and survival was never taken for granted. In the evenings, when the work in the fields and stables was done, she trained with the naginata, its long shaft and curved blade giving her reach against taller opponents. Hour after hour, she practiced the same fluid motions until the weapon felt like an extension of her own body, each swing cutting arcs through the cold night air. 7. Do you want me to push forward with more of her training years until we build up to her first actual taste of real combat? That will keep the pacing consistent and cinematic. Tomo's mastery was not forged by repetition alone, but by the challenges her family devised to test her under pressure. Her father believed that skill and practice meant nothing if it faltered under fear, so he trained her where fear lived. He would have her ride at full gallop down the narrow banks of the Shinano River, loosing arrows at straw targets that swayed in the current. If she missed, she had to ride back upstream, collect the arrow from the icy water, and try again. Some days, the wind off the mountains was so fierce it stung her eyes to tears, but she learned to shoot through them without breaking her aim. Other days, She was made to spar with her older brothers, who were told not to hold back. Their strikes were fast and heavy, and each blow she failed to block left a bruise she wore like a lesson carved into her flesh. In time, she stopped seeing the pain as punishment. It was proof that she was growing sharper, faster, more dangerous. By the time she reached her late teens, there were few in Ekigo, man or woman, who could best her with the bow, the naginata, or the sword. But skill alone would not earn her place in the chaos of the Genpei War. For that, she needed an ally whose ambitions matched her own, and fate brought him in the form of Minamoto no Yashinaka. 8. Do you want me to go straight into her meeting with Yashinaka next, or spend more time building her pre-war reputation before that turning point? Before fate tied her name to Minamoto no Yashinaka, Tomo had already begun to draw notice beyond her mountain home. Messengers and merchants traveling through Ekigo carried stories of the girl who rides like the wind and strikes like a hawk. At first, these tales were spoken with amusement, as if she were some novelty, a curiosity to be talked about over sake cups. But when local skirmishes broke out between rival landholders, Tomo's skill ceased to be a rumor. In one such clash, a band of raiders attempted to seize grain stores from her family's allies. Tomo mounted her horse without hesitation, riding directly into the enemy's path with only 3 men at her side. She cut through them with such precision and speed that survivors swore she was more phantom than flesh, her sword flashing once before each opponent fell. The victory was small by the standards of great wars, but it cemented her reputation as more than a village defender. She was a battlefield presence. Word traveled, as it always did in those days, through whispers and embellishment. Some said she could fire 3 arrows before the first struck its mark. Others claimed she could cut down a charging horse without touching the rider. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. She was a warrior who had never yet been beaten. 9. Next, I can take you into the moment she meets Yashinaka, where her personal legend intertwines with the tides of the Genpei War. Do you want me to move into that now? Minamoto no Yashinaka first heard of Tomo Guzan not from a court herald or seasoned general, but from a weathered soldier who had crossed paths with her in the northern provinces. The man spoke of her with the tone one reserves for describing a natural force, not merely skilled, but unstoppable when set in motion. Yashinaka was no ordinary commander. He was ambitious to the point of recklessness, a man determined to carve his own path, even if it meant defying the senior leaders of his own clan. When war scattered the Minamoto forces across Japan, Yashinaka saw opportunity where others saw only danger. To him, every battle was a stepping stone toward power, and he had no patience for tradition that stood in his way. So when the soldier told him of a woman in Ekigo who fought like 10 men and feared none, Yashinaka did not laugh. Instead, he sent word for her to come, not as an entertainer for the court or a curiosity to amuse the men, but as a warrior to stand at his side. When they finally met, it was not in a hall of polished wood, but in the open air, the snow still clinging to Tomo's armor from her journey. Yashinaka looked her over, measuring not her appearance, but the way she carried herself. Straight-backed, eyes steady, one hand resting lightly on her sword hilt, as if it belonged there more than anywhere else. Without a word, he gestured to the training field, and what followed was less an introduction than a test written in steel. 10. Do you want me to continue into that duel/trial scene where Yashinaka confirms her as one of his commanders? That will naturally lead us into the start of her active role in the Genpei War. Steel rang out against steel, the sound sharp and clean in the cold morning air. Yashinaka had not faced her himself, not yet, but had ordered one of his best retainers to test her. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried his blade with the easy confidence of a veteran who had survived more than one war. Tomo did not bow in the delicate, courtly manner expected of women. She dipped her head just enough to acknowledge him, then slid into her stance with the fluid certainty of one who had repeated it thousands of times. The first exchange was fast, a blur of motion that ended with the man forced 2 steps back in the snow. A murmur ran through the gathered warriors, but Yashinaka said nothing, his eyes narrowing in quiet calculation. The second exchange was longer, harder, the clash of blades ringing like temple bells struck in fury. Then Tomo's weapon slid past his guard, the tip resting just at the gap in his armor where neck met shoulder. She held it there, steady, the breath of her horse misting in the space between them. When she stepped back, lowering the blade, the retainer's nod carried the weight of more than respect. It was an admission of defeat. Yashinaka stood, a rare smile breaking across his face. "You will ride with me," he said simply, and in that moment, her place in history was sealed. Yashinaka's decision was immediate, but the consequences would echo for years. From that day forward, Tomo Guzan was not simply part of his retinue. She was one of his most trusted commanders. She was given her own contingent of riders, seasoned men who at first doubted her, but quickly learned that her orders were precise, her timing flawless, and her courage unshakable. On the march, she rode at the front, scanning the terrain with the instincts of someone raised in the mountains, spotting ambush points and hidden dangers before others could. In battle, she was more than a strategist. She was a presence, rallying her troops with the same calm authority she showed in training. Yashinaka valued her not as a novelty, but as an equal, and she repaid that trust with victories that expanded his influence during the Genpei War. Together, they would cut a path through Terra-held territory, each battle sharpening their reputations until both their names inspired fear in the enemy ranks. But for Tomo, this was not merely about serving a master. It was about proving that the blood, sweat, and discipline of her youth had forged her into something worthy of the battlefield's highest honors. The road ahead would be littered with challenges, betrayals, and choices that would test every ounce of her loyalty and skill. And all of it was leading, step by step, to the frozen plains of Awazu, where her legend would be sealed in steel and snow. The winter campaign that marked Tomo Guzan's first major test under Yashinaka began with a call to strike deep into Terra-held territory. Snow lay thick across the roads, making supply lines treacherous and slowing the heavy cavalry that most commanders relied upon. But Tomo saw opportunity in the frozen landscape. Where others saw obstacles, she saw cover. Her contingent moved swiftly, using narrow forest trails to bypass enemy patrols, striking villages and supply posts before the Terra could react. She led from the front, her white-plumed helmet becoming a sight that both emboldened her men and unnerved the enemy. Reports began to spread of a snow fox, whose sudden attacks left Terra camps in chaos before vanishing back into the trees. At the siege of Fukuwara, Tomo was tasked with holding a narrow bridge against a force nearly 3 times her number. For half a day, her riders held the line, cutting down every charge, their position buying Yashinaka enough time to flank and overwhelm the defenders. When the fortress fell, it was her name that soldiers whispered in the night, not just for the victory, but for the way she had stood unshaken against impossible odds. That winter, she was no longer seen as a curiosity in Yashinaka's army. She was a cornerstone of his war machine, and the Genpei War had truly become her war as well. 13. With each victory, Tomo Guzan's name carried farther than the snowbound provinces she had once called home. The spring thaw saw her riding south alongside Yashinaka's main force, striking deeper into the Terra heartlands. Her tactics grew bolder, rapid night raids on enemy outposts, sudden flanking maneuvers on the battlefield, and precision strikes on enemy commanders to collapse morale. At the battle near Kurakara, she led a detachment through a hidden mountain pass, appearing behind the enemy just as Yashinaka's main assault began. Caught between two forces, the Terra line broke in chaos, their retreat turning into a rout. Her ability to read terrain and anticipate enemy movements became her signature strength. She could turn an ordinary skirmish into a decisive blow with perfect timing. These victories won her more than just the respect of her comrades. They drew the wary attention of other Minamoto leaders, some of whom questioned the growing influence of a woman in Yashinaka's inner circle. But Yashinaka dismissed their doubts with the same simple truth. She delivered results when others hesitated. By the time the Minamoto forces secured Kyoto, Tomo's presence at Yashinaka's side was as much a symbol as it was a strategy. Proof that his command did not follow the old rules if breaking them meant winning. Yet beneath the triumphs, political tensions within the Minamoto ranks were beginning to brew, setting the stage for conflicts far deadlier than any open battlefield. 14. All right, let's finish the full arc so your script runs all the way to the end of Tomo Guzan's story, with cinematic flow and enough depth to sustain your long runtime. I'll carry it from the Minamoto internal rivalries straight through the Battle of Awazu and her legendary final stand. Rising tensions within the Minamoto clan. Victory in Kyoto did not bring peace for Yashinaka's forces. The city was a prize every Minamoto leader wanted to control, and Yashinaka's growing independence, and the presence of Tomo as one of his top commanders, made him a target for political attacks. Allies became rivals overnight. Accusations were whispered in court that Yashinaka sought to claim the shogunate for himself, that he ignored orders from Minamoto no Yoritamo, the clan's senior leader. Tomo watched these tensions grow like cracks in ice before spring, knowing they would split wide sooner or later. When Yashinaka was ordered to abandon Kyoto and return north, he refused. The order came again, this time backed by the march of Yoritamo's loyal generals, Minamoto no Yoshitsune and Minamoto no Noriyori, toward the capital. The Genpei War's greatest threat to Yashinaka would not come from the Terra, but from his own kin. The battle ignites. The clash began with the blare of horns and the thunder of hooves breaking the frozen ground. Yashinaka's forces met the first wave with a wall of steel, Tomo leading her cavalry in sweeping arcs to break enemy flanks. She cut down rider after rider, her naginata carving through armor with the precision of a master at work. For hours, they held their ground against overwhelming numbers. The snow churned into mud beneath the horses' hooves. But sheer force of numbers began to tell. Gaps opened in their lines, and Yashinaka's position became desperate. Tomo's last charge. Seeing the tide turning, Yashinaka is said to have told Tomo to leave the battlefield and save herself. But a warrior like Tomo did not simply retreat. Instead, she chose to carve one last moment into history. Spotting the enemy commander, Onda no Hachiro Morishige, she spurred her horse forward. The charge was a blur of white and steel. She closed the distance before he could react, unhorsed him with a single strike, and took his head in the same motion. The sight of it rippled through friend and foe alike, a final, defiant act in the face of certain defeat. Only then did she vanish from the battlefield, her exact fate lost to time and legend. The legacy of Tomo Guzan. Some say she died in battle that day, refusing to live in defeat. Others claim she lived out her years in seclusion, taking vows as a Buddhist nun. What is certain is that her name endured, passed down not only in war chronicles, but in the songs and stories of generations. She became a symbol of skill without compromise, of loyalty beyond politics, of the truth that a warrior's spirit knows no gender. In the frozen plains of Awazu, in the clash of the Genpei War, Tomo Guzan wrote herself into history with a blade's edge, and history has never let her go. All right, let's deepen the final act so it stretches naturally toward your 1 hour 40 minutes goal, keeping the voiceover cinematic and the pacing deliberate. I'll expand the Battle of Awazu sequence with richer scene building, troop movements, and emotional beats between Tomo and Yashinaka. The calm before the storm. The night before Awazu, the air was thick with the kind of silence only winter can bring. Tomo walked the perimeter of the camp, checking on her men. Some sat sharpening their blades by lantern light. Others rested with eyes half closed, saving their strength for dawn. She paused beside her horse, stroking its mane, feeling the steady warmth of the animal beneath her gloves. Yashinaka was seated apart, studying the dark line of the horizon as if he could already see the enemy banners beyond it. Their exchange was brief, a nod, a few quiet words, but in that moment, no orders needed to be spoken. Both knew this would be their final battle together. The enemy approaches. At first light, the snow reflected a pale gold, masking the oncoming army until their ranks crested the ridge in a black and red wave. The sound reached them before the sight, the rolling thunder of hooves, the hiss of arrows cutting through the air. Tomo's riders formed a crescent in front of Yashinaka's position, shields raised, bows ready. The first volley was theirs, a rain of steel that dropped the leading horses before they could close the distance. But the enemy was relentless, their numbers surging forward like a tide that could not be stopped. Tomo's precision on the field. Rather than hold the center, Tomo split her force in two, riding hard along the flanks to strike at the enemy's sides. Each maneuver was sharp, timed to disrupt their formations, and by the center precious minutes. She called out commands over the clash of metal, her voice carrying through the chaos like a war drum. Every movement was deliberate, conserving strength, striking only where it would shatter morale. Her white armor became a beacon in the fray, soldiers on both sides tracking her by instinct, as though knowing where she rode would decide where the battle turned. The moment with Yashinaka. Midway through the fight, Yashinaka's position grew desperate. His horse had been killed under him, and his guards were falling one by one. Tomo broke through a knot of enemy riders to reach him, her naginata spinning in tight arcs that sent attackers reeling. He looked at her, a grim smile beneath the sweat and frost on his face. "Go," he told her, not as an order, but as a plea. She shook her head once. Not yet. The legendary charge. Spurring her horse, She scanned the field until she found Onda no Hachiro Morishige, a massive figure whose presence rallied the enemy like a standard. The charge was a straight line through chaos, her horse leaping over fallen men and crashing through the enemy guard. Steel met steel, the clash ringing out above the roar of battle, and in a single decisive motion, she struck him down. Lifting his head high for her men to see, she gave them a final rallying cry that carried over the field. The disappearance into legend. With that act, she turned her horse and rode from the heart of the fight. Some say she cut her way free and vanished into the mountains. Others that she fell soon after, her body never recovered. Yashinaka fought on until he was overwhelmed, his death marking the end of their stand. But Tomo's name lived on, her final charge becoming a story told by warriors for centuries. If you want, I can now layer in more tactical and sensory detail, like the freezing wind cutting through armor, the sound of hooves on crusted snow, the slow-motion feel of her last duel, to bring this to full cinematic length. Should I go ahead and add that layer? You said. Next. ChatGPT said. Got it, I'll take the expanded cinematic approach for the very end, layering in sensory and tactical detail, so the closing sequence has the weight and runtime you need. The weight of the air. The wind at Owazu that morning was razor-sharp, slicing through every gap in the armor. Snow crusted on the edges of helmets, melting only when the heat of battle began. Tomo could feel the rhythm of her horses breathing beneath her legs, the deep, steady rise and fall that kept her centered even as her pulse quickened. Every breath she took stung her lungs, but the cold also sharpened her. Every sound, every motion on the field seemed brighter, clearer, inevitable. The battlefield unfolds. From her vantage point on a small rise, she saw the enemy formations spreading across the plain, their armor like a shifting tide of black, red, and glinting silver. Standard bearers thrust their banners into the wind, the Terra crest snapping against the pale sky. The ground beneath the snow was frozen hard, but the first charges would churn it to slick mud. Tomo calculated distances, the time it would take for the front lines to reach her, the moment to loose the first arrow, the place where their formation would stretch too thin. Strain in the ranks. Her men gripped their weapons tighter as the enemy advanced. She knew their breath was coming faster now, the nervous energy before steel met steel. Tomo called out to them, voice steady over the rush of wind. Hold. We meet them when they are weakest, not when they are strongest. They listened. They always did. The first clash. The impact was a wall of sound, hooves striking earth, blades scraping shields, the crash of bodies colliding. Tomo's right flank buckled for a heartbeat, but she was already moving, her naginata sweeping low to unhorse a rider before pivoting to strike another. Her men surged behind her, the crescent formation folding inward to trap and break the front ranks of the enemy. The last exchange with Yashinaka. She broke free long enough to reach Yashinaka's position. His armor was dented, his hair loosened from its knot, but his eyes were fierce. "This is our last field," he said, and she understood. Still, she only answered, "Then let us make it one they'll never forget." The charge into legend. The moment she spotted Onda no Hachiro Morishige, the battlefield seemed to narrow to a single point. She pressed her knees into her horse's sides, feeling its muscles bunch before the surge forward. Arrows hissed past. One grazed her shoulder, but she didn't falter. She hit his guard like a storm, her blade knocking his aside in a flash of steel. One heartbeat later, his head fell, and the shouts around her turned from rage to disbelief. The fade into mystery. Holding the trophy high, she gave her last rallying cry. Her men roared back, but in the next moments, the field swallowed her. Some swore they saw her riding toward the mountains, white against white until she vanished into the storm. Others believed she fell in the chaos, her body lost beneath the snow and mud. Whatever the truth, the legend remained, a final image burned into the memory of every warrior at Owazu. If you want, I can now give you the fully stitched, end-to-end 1 hour 40 minutes runtime script with this expanded closing act seamlessly merged into everything we've written so far. That way, you'll have a single continuous flow, ready for recording. Echoes after Owazu. The snow kept falling long after the sounds of battle faded. Where moments before the field had been alive with the crash of steel and the cries of warriors, now only the wind moved, sweeping over fallen banners and lifeless shapes half buried in white. Some survivors stumbled away toward the forests, limping, armor dented, faces blank with the shock of having lived when so many had not. Among them, no one could say for certain what became of Tomo Guzan. Her absence was not emptiness. It was a presence, like the memory of thunder after lightning. Whispers of fate. In the years that followed, stories of that day multiplied. Some claimed she lived as a wandering warrior, her hair streaked with silver, fighting in small battles far from the capital until she finally vanished from record. Others swore she renounced the sword entirely, taking vows in a remote temple where her armor lay hidden in a wooden chest. Each tale ended differently, but all agreed on one truth. She had walked from Owazu alive. The unbroken spirit. Tomo's legacy did not rest in monuments or the neat lines of official chronicles. It lived in the way warriors spoke of her in the training yards, the way young archers tried to match her impossible precision, the way horsemen tested themselves against the speed of her charges. Her story became a mirror for every fighter who ever faced an impossible battle, a reminder that skill, courage, and resolve can carve a name into history even when the world tries to erase it. The final image. Close your eyes, and the last you see of her is this. A lone rider in white, the curve of her naginata catching the pale winter sun, the plume of her helmet trailing like a comet's tail. The battlefield stretches ahead, but she does not slow. Each stride carries her farther into the space between history and legend, a space where Tomo Guzan still rides, undefeated. After the storm, by the time the wind cleared the snow from the plain, Owazu was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard. The banners that had once stood proud now lay tangled and torn, their colors dulled by frost and blood. Shattered weapons jutted from the ground like crooked teeth, each one marking the place where a warrior had fallen. Some horses, riderless, still wandered between the bodies, steam rising from their flanks in the cold air. No footsteps in the snow. Those who searched for Tomo Guzan found nothing. No broken armor, no body, no blood trail leading away. Her horse's tracks disappeared into a stretch of wind-blown drifts where the snow had smoothed itself over as if hiding her passage. Some swore they saw her silhouette once more in the distance, framed against the white horizon. But when they gave chase, there was nothing there but mist and winter silence. The story outlives the woman. In the years after, when warriors gathered by the fire on cold nights, the story of Owazu would always return to her. They told it in the pauses between verses of war songs, in the moments before a charge, in the quiet talks between soldiers who had seen too much. It wasn't only her skill they remembered. It was the way she refused to bend, the way she fought like the storm itself had chosen her as its blade. The unending ride. Even now, in the telling, she never truly stops riding. The plains of Owazu fade into the mists of time, but Tomo Guzan remains there, a flash of white armor, a plume caught in the wind, a sword that cuts both history and legend in a single stroke. She does not slow, she does not look back, and she never lets the world forget that she was here. The last light over Owazu. As the sun dipped toward the western hills, its light turned the snow a deep gold, casting long shadows across the silent plain. The echoes of battle were gone now, replaced by the faint creak of ice settling over the ground. From the ridge where she had last been seen, the horizon stretched unbroken. No rider, no banner, only the wind carrying whispers no one could catch. The road only she could ride. Some said she had gone to seek vengeance for Yashinaka in her own time, a blade in the dark, striking at those who had turned against him. Others believed she had turned her back on war entirely, riding until the weight of the past fell away and the mountains welcomed her into their quiet heart. Perhaps she was both, warrior and wanderer, choosing her own ending beyond the reach of history. The legend's shadow. Long after her time, when war came again to the provinces, men swore they had seen a lone rider in white on the eve of battle. She would appear at a distance, watching in silence, before vanishing like mist. Whether spirit or story, her presence was a promise that courage could return when the world needed it most. A name that outlives stone. There are no great monuments to Tomo Guzan, no towering statues or gilded halls in her honor. Instead, her memorial is carried in the stories of soldiers, in the art of those who never saw her but knew her name, and in the quiet respect of anyone who has ever stood outnumbered and chosen to fight anyway.